with that, would love to open it up to you.
Well, first of all, thank you, David, for inviting me and for convening this gathering, this conversation. I really appreciate it. There is something counterintuitive, you're right, about challenging what seems to be an inspiring ideal, the ideal of meritocracy, the idea that if chances are equal, then those who work hard and make it to the top deserve their winnings and deserve all the benefits that a market society bestows upon them. What could be wrong with the idea that people should be free to rise based on their own merits? To try to make sense of this counterintuitive suggestion, I'd like to step back just to begin and take a look across our civic life. It's not going very well. And I think the reason for the deep polarization, David, is that the divide between winners and losers has been deepening in recent decades. This has a lot to do with the deepening inequality over the past 4 decades of market-driven globalization. But it's not only the inequality. It's not only stagnant wages and job losses among many working people. It's also to do with the changing attitudes toward winning and losing that have accompanied this inequality. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit. And by implication, that those who fall short, those who've been left behind, must deserve their fate as well. This last part is the dark side of meritocracy. It's inspiring to tell people that if chances are equal, you should be able to rise if you work hard. But this promise, this meritocratic promise, has turned out to be corrosive of the common good, of the sense that we are all in it together. And the reason it's had this effect, unfolded in this way, is that persuading the winners that they deserve their success, that it's their own doing, creates a kind of meritocratic hubris, as I call it. And it also creates humiliation among those left behind. And this brings us to the present political moment. I think one of the most potent sources of the backlash against elites that we've seen, culminating in 2016 with the election of Trump in the US, the vote for Brexit in Britain, the appeal of authoritarian populist parties in much of Europe. One of the most potent sources of this backlash is the sense among many working people that elites look down on them, and that the work they do is no longer respected as it once was. So this is the diagnosis that I offer in the book of how we arrived at this polarized condition, how the anger and resentment among many working people built up unaddressed in recent decades and finally burst forth in sometimes ugly expression, but containing a legitimate grievance. That's the tricky thing to disentangle. And the legitimate grievance is to do with this tendency of meritocratic elites, governing elites, not to be alive to the sense of humiliation that a great many working people feel.
It's really interesting, and as I said at the opening, unbelievably timely. There's a lot of words that have been thrown around in the media and in politics over the last number of years, sort of defining the world that we live in today, whether it's populism, racism, anti-immigration, nationalization. The political polarization really does feel like we're at a new peak here. Why is that so? Haven't we lived in an elitist society with hierarchies and capitalism, to use one of your words, for centuries? Why does it feel like we've entered almost a new realm of this rancor?
I think for a couple of reasons. One of them is that we have embraced with greater and greater intensity in recent decades a certain kind of market faith, by which I mean a belief that market mechanisms are the primary instruments for defining and achieving the public good. And closely connected to that, we've fallen into the assumption that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. This, I think, is a mistake. We can think of lots of examples where there's a yawning gap between what gets rewarded in the labor market and what really counts as a valuable contribution to the society. Take an example of a casino mogul, a billionaire casino mogul, and compare his earnings to that of, let's say, a school teacher, or the best teacher you had in high school. If you can conjure up that person, each of us has.
I can. I hope she can't, but I can.
What was her name, David?
What's that? Miss Marks.
Miss Marks. Okay. In what subject did she teach?
French.
Okay.
Wonderful woman.
So Miss Marks made maybe 1/1000th of what the casino mogul makes. And let's assume he built his casinos honestly and legally. Let's assume that. Do we really think that this market verdict shows that the casino mogul's contribution to the common good really is 1,000 times more valuable than that of Mrs. Marks? Most people would say, obviously not. But if that's true, then it's a mistake to outsource, which is what we've done, to outsource our moral judgments to markets, to let markets persuade us about what is and what isn't an important contribution to the common good. And when we do this at a time when inequality is deepening, and when the most lavish rewards are bestowed on those, say, in the financial industry, people, let's say, engaged in high-frequency trading, whose contributions to the common good, to put it gently, are not so obvious. I mean, is it really that important to the economy that instead of a millisecond, someone can do a trade in a fraction of a millisecond? Probably not. That doesn't invest or provide more capital for new businesses or factories or homes or hospitals or schools or roads or airports. So there's a growing gulf between the way we reward certain contributions and what we would all agree, if we reflected on, really are important contributions to the economy and to the common good. So what I think we need to do is to have a broader public debate about how, not only how to confer material rewards in some better approximation to people's real contributions, but also social recognition and esteem, respect and honor. Because I think part of what has made for such a rancorous political scene is the sense among many working people, not only that elites are looking down on them, especially if they don't have a four-year college degree, but also that the work they do is no longer valued and respected in the way it once was. This is deeply demoralizing, even humiliating. And as we've seen, Donald Trump, if he can do anything, he can appeal very effectively. He can tap into the sense of humiliation, the sense of grievance that a great many working people feel. That's not to say that he has addressed that in any meaningful way, that he's addressed the sources of the grievance, but he was able in 2016 and in the years since, to a large extent, to appeal, to tap into that sense of humiliation and grievance. And until the mainstream parties figure out a constructive way of speaking directly to those resentments, to that discontent, to those legitimate grievances, until they do that, I think they're going to have a hard time healing our society and overcoming the polarization, whatever happens in November.
It does feel as though across the political spectrum, from the far left to the extreme right, the only real commonality is that feeling of anger and distrust.
Right.
And it's obviously a very troubling moment. Maybe to frame the conversation up front, you know, it's obviously a very imperfect world and an imperfect set of systems that we live in, whether it's capitalism or democracy or democratic republic. Are we talking about, you know, scrapping the system and starting over? Or are we talking about improving ourselves within the system? And, you know, whether it's tax policy or other policy to reprioritize our agenda of how we hold various contributions, you know, to our world in high regard.
I think it's a matter of reconfiguring the economy that we have in a way that brings a better alignment between the work people do and the contributions they receive. Think about the experience that all of us, I think, have had during this pandemic, when those of us who have the luxury of being able to work from home and to hold meetings on Zoom, we nonetheless realize, maybe in a way we didn't fully realize before, how deeply we depend on workers we often overlook. I'm thinking not mainly of the people in hospitals who are caring for COVID patients and doing God's work. I'm thinking of delivery workers, warehouse workers, grocery store clerks, truckers, home healthcare providers, childcare workers. These are not the best paid or most honored workers in our society. And yet now we are calling them, rightly, essential workers. So we have already, during this pandemic, begun a subtle shift in our attitudes and valuations of the kinds of work done by many people who are not lavishly credentialed with university degrees, but who nonetheless, we realize, we couldn't get by without. So this might be one small example, David, of how we could, there may be an opening for a broader public debate about how to reconfigure our economy to bring a better alignment between the work people do and the rewards they get, both in terms of pay, but also in terms of respect and honor and social recognition.
It's interesting. Two, I guess, audiences, because, you know, it's an important message, but, you know, as you said up front, it's a little counterintuitive, you know, and nuanced vis-a-vis, you know, the proverbial American dream. And, you know, if you work hard, you can go as far as your efforts and talent take you. How do we tell this message to our, I have 4 kids, I need help. How do we tell this message to our children, the role of luck in life, and that role of luck not, you know, diminishing the value of hard work, you know, in one sense. And I guess the other end of the coin is, you know, selfishly in our business, in a corporate context, you know, you still want to go to the best doctor. You'd like to have the best Harvard philosopher, professor. How do we, you know, instill inside of our company and inside of our children, you know, the important message that you have without undermining, you know, the things that have gotten us as a society this far? Right.
It's a great question. And there's not a simple, easy answer, but it's the right question for us to wrestle with. Here's how I begin. I am not criticizing the idea that we should try to get well-qualified people doing the jobs at which they excel. If I need to have surgery or to arrange surgery for a loved one, I want a very well-qualified surgeon to do the operation. No doubt about that. So in that respect, I'm all for merit. And as for what we tell our children, I think you put it very sensitively, David. On the one hand, we want our kids to be motivated, to work hard, to pursue their passions, and to develop their talents. And sometimes this takes a special kind of devotion and effort and striving even. And yet at the same time, we don't want to motivate them to do so by telling them that the winnings you will reap if you succeed, if you work hard, the winnings you will reap will be due only to your efforts. We want at the same time, and in a way, I agree with you, it's a double message. We want them to have a certain appreciation of their good fortune, of the role of luck in life. We want them to know that when they succeed and also when they fail, that there are elements of luck in life. And we want them, I think, but you'll tell me what you think, David, we want them, by appreciating the element of luck that may be a part of what accounts for their success if they succeed. We want that to generate in our kids, and ideally in ourselves, a certain humility, so that when we look upon those in our society who struggle, who haven't flourished, that we can picture ourselves at least in their shoes. That the ability to look around and say, there, but for the accident of fate or the grace of God or the luck of the draw, go I. And this opens us to a politics of the common good. It enables us to have a keener sense of what we owe one another as citizens. Whereas if we believe, or if we somehow encourage our kids to believe, that our success is our own doing, the measure of our merit, then it's very hard to cultivate a sense of the role that luck and good fortune that helped me on my way. It's difficult to cultivate a sense of indebtedness to family, to neighborhood, to teachers, to community, to country, to the times in which we live. All of these, I think we want our kids to appreciate, are elements of success. And that makes a difference for our sense of obligation to those who may struggle or who have been left behind by the way the economy has unfolded. I mean, does that double message make sense?
No, I wouldn't use the word double message. I'd say it's layered. It's a very layered conversation, and it's, different to have it with a young child as opposed to a high schooler looking to get into college, or frankly, somebody young in their career looking to advance in their career. And I think, the way that I at least frame it in my mind is, it's a little bit of a reorientation in talking to people about the value of work and effort for its sake, as opposed to the reward at the end of the tunnel. And the nuanced version of it that we talk about is, I've rarely seen people very successful in life, however you want to define that, who are doing something that they're not passionate about.
Right.
And so I think finding the passion that you have for what you do all day, every day, because life is both very long and very short, as we've learned over the last 7 or 8 months. You have to do something that you love. And hopefully that's a reorientation on the value of work for its own sake. And for the respect and admiration for what everybody else does, whether they're a hedge fund manager or a grocery clerk. I can tell you that I think we've paid more attention to the FedEx delivery man and the person who brings you your medicine over the last 6 or 7 months than I can remember. It does feel like we're really at that fork in the road, or maybe we're fortunate that we're at an inflection point where there is now a newfound understanding and respect for essential workers across the board. but there's still the other side of the coin where, it does feel like we're in a K recovery, not a V and not a U. And a lot of participants in financial markets, frankly, have come out better than ever. And there's a lot of folks, who lost their jobs, who are in very, very difficult spots right now. And so, I'm hopeful that, we're at that inflection point that you talked about. But I think the lurking K, thing that we all have to be very, very aware of.
I'd like to pick up, David, on your observation just now about cultivating in our kids and in adults as well, the idea of the value of work for its own sake, the sense of mission and purpose and passion. I find that the same is true and needs to be, that we need to remind ourselves of a similar message when we're thinking about education, teaching and learning. Because part of what I worry about as a teacher, as someone who spent a career in higher education, but also as a parent, are the tremendous pressures for achievement that bear down on young people, especially during high school years, at least in those families that aspire for their kids to compete for admission to selective colleges and universities. And this intensification of the pressure to achieve, I think, reflects another side of the tyranny of merit. We've been talking about those who have been left behind and humiliated by the loss of the dignity of their work, those who haven't been to college. But another side of the tyranny of merit that worries me, David, bears down upon the children of the successful. It leads to wounded winners. And I notice among my students, these are the survivors of a stress-strewn meritocratic gauntlet that they've endured, often trying to please through achievement. Parents and teachers and coaches and college counselors and admissions officers. And the danger is that even having triumphed and prevailed on this in this meritocratic tournament, by the time they get to college, they find that the habit of hoop jumping is hard to break. And it makes it more difficult to explore and pursue learning for its own sake. This is why I think it's parallel to your point about the intrinsic value of work and vocation and calling. Learning for its own sake, exploring new fields, figuring out what's worth caring about, what fields of study they'd really like to pursue, is obstructed by the habits of mind and heart that too often are generated by this frenzied obsession with competition to build a resume and a transcript that will lead to admission to one of these highly selective places. And I think that's one of the other damaging effects of this intensified meritocratic understanding of success, that it makes it hard to step back and love learning for its own sake. I worry that the sorting machine function of our universities, the credentializing function that they perform in a meritocratic society, is at risk of crowding out our educational function.
Oh, there's so much I want to talk about. I mean, first, the point you make is unbelievably important, and honestly not a particularly discussed aspect of the world that we live in, because there's obviously more people suffering and going without than there are wounded winners.
Right.
But I think about the conveyor belt of life, and sort of always looking to reach up that next rung of ladder without really sort of stepping back and thinking about where the ladder goes. A little bit of a tangent to the tyranny of merit, but I've seen you say before, before we can define and defend people's rights, we have to, at least state what the good life is.
Right.
And I'm super curious right now, to hear your take on what is the good life, because I think all of us are, struggling to figure that out in our daily lives. And maybe the last, 6 or 7 months have given us a little bit more time to slow down and be thoughtful about that. But, what is the good life?
Wow,
That's just a big question.
that is a big question, and I can't give a fully adequate answer to it. But I would say there are many good lives, first of all, and what they have in common is that an important feature of the good life is learning to care about certain passions, pursuits, aims, aspirations for their own sake, for their intrinsic worth, not as means or stepping stones to something else. Now, this may seem a not very demanding notion or of the common good, or ingredient, of the good life. But it's surprising how often we need this as a corrective to the way we think about our aims and purposes, whether thinking about young people on an educational track, often laid out by well-meaning parents who are nonetheless, who find themselves becoming helicopter parents, or in the world of work, where we define our career aspirations in terms of a stepping stone, this for the sake of that, for the sake of that, and without ever stepping back to reflect on what activities and pursuits, whether in our work lives, or in our personal lives, or in our relation to our community, what are those pursuits that actually matter to us and ought to matter to us for their own sake, because they're intrinsically fulfilling or worthwhile, not because they are good stepping stones to something else. So I would say that's at least one component of the good life that is under pretty intense pressure by the kind of relentless meritocratic pressure, also market-driven mode of life that we find ourselves facing.
I would hope there's not just one answer to that question, and I would also hope that we're in a point in time where people can spend more time at least asking themselves what that means to them. You mentioned.
Do you think, just to put to you this question, do you think that during the pandemic people have found some space for reflection that they didn't have before, or not?
Listen, I think it's by fortune if you have that ability to step back. I think that this pandemic has frankly been a real tale of two cities.
Yeah.
And I think, for most folks out there, they haven't had the time to sit back and think those big thoughts. I think they have to, worry about, keeping their jobs and, taking care of their children and homeschooling and Zooming. And so unfortunately, I think most people have been running harder and faster to stay in place.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a level of exhaustion that people have felt that is, doesn't really sort of jive with being at home.
Yeah.
That being said, I think there are those are fortunate who have been able to take a step back and say, really, why have I been, trying to, reach to pay the private school tuition or stay in New York City? Turns out my kids really like the backyard and this air smells really good and the beach isn't such a bad thing. And so I do think that, there are trends that we will come out of this where, we're primarily in the roofing business. And so a big conversation that, is going on in our industry is, just an increased trend towards suburbanization and that has a big impact for our business. But I think it's a more telling answer to your question, which I think people are reevaluating their priorities, their agendas, how they spend their time, what it means to be with their children. And so I think the answer is, unfortunately, most people don't have the luxury of spending time thinking about these things. But for those who do, I do think people have been rethinking their lives and the choices that they make. And what I find the most interesting, I hadn't thought about it as I read your book, but I'm thinking about it more differently now, is, I go straight to, the politics of all of this and, what have the various parties done right? What have they done wrong? What's the answer to the, very black and white sort of thought, I get the problem, how do we fix the problem? And it really feels like much of what you're talking about, I want to come back to credentialism, which you mentioned briefly, it really starts at home, and it starts with, families, and it starts with how you speak to your children and how you sort of, tell them to think about their lives and their opportunities. And obviously there's a role for government, there's a role for higher education, there's a role for, employers and leaders in our world, but it really feels like this does start at home with families and parenting. But maybe you could talk to us a little bit about credentialism and what you mean when you talk about that.
Yes, well, I think it goes back to what we were discussing earlier, David, about the growing sense among many working people that elites look down on them. The credentialism fills in that story and how it happened and how it's connected actually to the promise of meritocracy, paradoxically. Because the meritocratic promise, the offer is, all right, we have deepening inequality. This is what the political leaders of both parties said. We're not going to take on the inequality itself, but if you want to compete and win in the global economy, get a university degree, preferably from a good place or even a brand name place. Then you as an individual may be able to rise. So they made mobility, individual upward mobility through higher education, as the answer to inequality. Now, part of the problem is mobility is not an adequate answer to inequality, because notwithstanding the faith, and you mentioned the American dream, David, at the beginning, the American dream that it's possible to rise. It's actually harder to rise from being born poor in the US today than it is in many places in Europe and than it is in Canada. It is not easy to rise. Social mobility has stalled. So that's one problem with conceiving mobility as the solution to inequality. But to come directly to credentialism, emphasizing the need to get a college degree as a condition of rising or flourishing in the new economy has put a tremendous premium on having a 4-year university degree. And yet, we can easily forget this. Most Americans don't have a 4-year university degree. Nearly 2/3 don't. And this is true, roughly the same is true in Britain and in most European countries. But the emphasis, the relentless emphasis on rising through getting a 4-year university degree has put such a premium on a diploma that not only has the wage premium of a college degree increased, that is, the average wages earned by those with a degree compared to those without one, but it's become valorized, a source of honor to have these credentials. And those who lack a 4-year degree find themselves in forms of work that enjoy less social esteem and recognition. This is what I mean by credentialism. And so this actually is what accounts for the insult implicit in that seemingly inspiring offer. What you earn will depend on what you learn. Go to college. But that left a whole lot of people, actually the majority of people, out of this charmed circle of highly credentialed professionals. And it fueled the resentment, understandably. Actually, surveys have been done asking college-educated people their views of various groups that are commonly discriminated against or disfavored. And for all the long list of groups the group that people will acknowledge they dislike most are people who are less well educated. It's as if,
Unabashedly so.
yes, yeah. I mean, there is still there's still prejudice, sadly, on the basis of race and ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation. But people at least are embarrassed to acknowledge it. Whereas when the survey researchers ask and give a list of these groups, or immigrants, for example, Muslims, they asked about Muslim immigrants in European countries, and they gave a long list of commonly disfavored groups. The least educated, that was the group most disliked by college-educated people in the US and in Europe in these surveys. So it bears out the thought that credentialism is really, in a way, the last acceptable prejudice. And I think the reason for that has to do with the promise that was offered, this, what I would say, inadequate response to the inequality that we've experienced.
It makes a lot of sense. Is credentialism used either by society or by employers, some version of a measuring stick, a weighing station, to sort through who they want to hire, who they want to associate with? And if we sort of even attempt to address credentialism of higher education, and I think that the number is something like 2/3 of Americans don't have a 4-year degree. Right. Are we just as humans going to replace one version of credentialism and measuring with another one?
I think it does loom large in hiring decisions and in admission decisions in all kinds of ways. And very often it leads us astray. I mean, you'll tell me what your experience is in the world of business, but I think there are many times when employers will require certain credentials, especially, diplomas of various kinds, university degrees, in hiring for jobs where that metric is imperfectly related to the skills and the abilities and the aptitudes necessary to do the job. But it becomes an easy way of sorting, even though it may not be all that relevant to the job. And so this, I think, is a further way in which we entrench credentialism.
I think that's a very good point. And, we've been, focused on our hiring decisions and how we go about, talent across the entirety of the organization, from manufacturing folks to scientists to salespeople. And one of the things we've been focusing on is what we call widening the aperture, looking for people in places that you wouldn't normally think or wouldn't ordinarily think to find people, either in different industries or with different experiences in different backgrounds. And two things. One, not sacrificing talent in doing that, widening the aperture, but still having the same high bar for, performance and expectations.
Right.
And then really trying to tell the story that, and if you want to use the word diversity, because that is, when as you widen the aperture, you have a more diverse, talent pool, actually becomes a competitive advantage. And, it's only because we have, more people with more ideas and different experiences that we have some version of a competitive advantage. So I think it's a really interesting, topic. Obviously, it's a very important topic, as diversity inclusion, rightfully so, has taken a front stage in many corporations across America and across the world. And I think telling the story that it's a good thing to do because it's a good thing to do, but more important than that is it's actually a competitive advantage, to have your organization be a truly diverse organization.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. So in that way, credentialism can become a kind of lazy metric.
Yes.
That prevents organizations, be they companies or other institutions, from inquiring more deeply and more broadly into what mix of talents and backgrounds will best serve the company or the organization.
I couldn't agree more. Having gone to a brand name university and been somewhat credentialed, I promise you, I'm not sure my first employer knew what they were getting. So I couldn't agree more. I know I'm being sensitive to time, and I'm going to have to figure out the technology of asking the questions. But just before we get to the questions, I'm interested in your thoughts on the politics of this. And I know, I'm sure we could spend another hour just on this, but what have the two parties really gotten right and really gotten wrong? And are they even, sort of focused on the issues at hand? Or is the narrative that you talk about in your book one that's not really, even sort of being appropriately discussed?
I don't see much evidence that we're getting very close to a more robust kind of public discourse of the kind that I suggest. One of the implications of my diagnosis of what got us into this polarized condition is that we should put right at the center of politics the question of the dignity of work. What does it mean to, what would it mean to renew the dignity of work? And now that's, everyone can affirm the dignity of work in a kind of rhetorical, hortatory level, but what would it mean in practice to reform our society and our economy in ways that really did give everyone who contributes to the common good through the work they do a sense of not only of fair pay, but social recognition and esteem and honor and respect? What would that look like? What policies might we change to make that happen? I mean, I can think of a few that should at least be on the table. I mentioned them in the book. One of them is, I think we woefully underinvest in those forms of learning on which the majority of our fellow citizens depend to prepare themselves for the world of work. I'm thinking of state colleges, two-year community colleges, vocational and technical training. Not only do we fail to invest adequately in these forms of learning, but we also don't accord them and those who pursue their educations there with the kind of social recognition and honor and esteem that they deserve. We have this very steep hierarchy of esteem between selective four-year colleges and universities on the one hand, and the forms of learning where most Americans actually learn what they need to learn to go out into the world and contribute to the economy. It's not that way everywhere. Germany does a much better job of investing in a broader range of institutions of learning, and also does a better job of according recognition and respect, as well as pay, to people who learn a skill or a trade in through vocational or technical training programs. We don't. So that would be one area. And then I have various other suggestions, which we could get into later if we have time, depending on the questions, on how to reconfigure the tax system, at least to prompt debate.
Sure.
About what the dignity of work really means.
Sure. Well, I want to make sure that others get to ask you questions as well. So I'm going to turn to that. The first one I see here is from Rich Robinson, who's our Global Chief Technology Officer. And Rich asks, to what degree do you think social media has created or exasperated the situation? And how can we address this?
The short answer is social media has exacerbated the polarization and the rancor and the bitterness. And one of the reasons it's done so is that tweets and short anonymous exchange, very often anonymous exchanges, are not conducive of the kind of reasoned debate that we need to address these kinds of questions. In a way, the crisis of our society, the polarization, the anger, the resentment, the rancor, expresses itself in our inability to reason together about hard questions of values. We're not very good at that. What passes for public discourse these days is either narrow managerial technocratic talk, which inspires no one, or shouting matches, where people shout past one another without really listening. And social media abets this tendency. Epithets, shouting matches, expletives, the lack of responsibility for an extended argument. It essentially gives up on the project of persuasion. And the project of persuasion requires listening. You can't very easily persuade someone without first figuring out why they disagree with you and where they're coming from. And so listening really is at the heart of the art of democratic public discourse. In the social media platforms we have today don't cultivate listening. No. They cultivate proclaiming and hurling epithets and shouting. What to do about it? We need to deliberately design alternative platforms for civic deliberation. Some can be mediated by technology. Technology in itself is not antithetical to learning and to reasoning and to listening. We did an experiment, putting my justice course online some years ago, just making it freely available as a public resource, just to see how technology might extend the reach of learning and open access to the classroom, especially on a civic subject of importance. And so technology can be a resource, but the social media platforms we have today are driven by trying to sell advertising,
sure,
which means they're driven by eye-catching devices, which usually means very little sustained argument or reflection or persuasion, and mainly a kind of assault, trying to press our buttons to capture our eyeballs to sell us stuff. That's what it amounts to, as best I can understand it.
Yeah, no, it's an unbelievably challenging situation. I clearly don't have any answers, because it does feel like, the power, well, it's sort of the democratization of voice, where any voice is louder than you would otherwise, have. But it's very hard to sort through. And, I'm not sure what the answer is. There are politicians who I know who are really challenged in terms of getting their messages out, because in a 2-second soundbite or in one hashtag, they've so disenfranchised the left or the right that nobody can get past the first couple of inches to tell the story. And most complicated things in life are nuanced and gray and not black and white. And I fear that some of this, media, sort of almost, is a unavoidable hurdle or obstacle in telling stories. But I think we do know from the success of justice is now, I guess, the most widely watched, class in the world, that it does work, that technology really does work, but it poses a whole new set of challenges as well. Our next question is from Beth Kesniak. And I'm very happy that you're being asked this question, because I'm not sure there is an actual answer to it. But you typically ask your students to take a side in moral situations. Given the recent COVID outbreak in Washington and its connection to the Rose Garden event where people did not wear masks, how would you make a moral argument against wearing a mask?
Well, I would... it would not be an argument that I myself agree with, but I would try to begin, Beth, by understanding why, despite the clear public health benefits of wearing a mask, not wearing a mask has become a position, really a quite passionately held position, in the culture wars. And I think there are two, as I understand it. So I think we've got to begin by trying to interpret why the resistance. And I think there are two answers, or at least this is how it strikes me. One of them is an argument about individual liberty. This is mainly an argument against mask mandates. mandatory mask wearing required by states or conceivably by the federal government. And this would be an argument about individual liberty. I should be free to decide for myself whether or not to wear a mask, kind of libertarian objection. And to that objection, we would then have a debate about whether this is truly self-regarding behavior. If the mask only protected me, the analogy would be maybe a motorcycle helmet. Then we could have a debate. Should a person be free to ride a motorcycle without a helmet, provided that a motorcycle rider won't depend on public funds in case of injury? Then you could have a libertarian debate. So if a mask were just protecting me, then I could see the force of the libertarian argument. But since the mask is protecting others, not just me, the libertarian case is harder to defend. But that would be one way of framing it. And then the other, I think, source of opposition to mask wearing has a broader cultural significance. It's a token of resistance to a certain kind of authority. And this goes back to the backlash against elites. It's a resistance, a cultural and political resistance against the authority of political elites who constantly invoke science as if they, and science as they interpret it, can tell us or everyone what to do and how to do it. And this cuts closer to the so-called populist backlash against elites, David, that we were discussing earlier.
Sure.
I think this opposition to mask wearing grows right out of this. It's about authority, it's about trust, and it's about not wanting elites who have handled the economy rather poorly and to the disadvantage of a great many working people, not to push us around by saying science requires that we tell you to do this. So I think this is another dimension quite apart from the matter of individual liberty. And to unpack that is to take on the whole tyranny of merit. I mean, we're back to the themes we were discussing earlier.
No, it's funny. It reminds me of a lot of your sort of contrasting the states from Europe, and twofold. One, at least for myself, when I hear about, sort of the case against masks, I don't, I think it's at this point at least proven that wearing a mask is probably the most effective thing that we as a society can do to protect everyone. It feels like more of an attack on the whole idea of the common good, which, we talked about up front, which, I guess there's still some debate, whether libertarian debates or others, as to the import or the value of the common good. But I do agree that there's an American dynamic to this,
right.
Where, there's far more skepticism, associated with, authority or elites telling you what to do, and I guess impacting, masks inappropriately so, as opposed to other areas of the world where, masks have frankly been far more accepted.
Yeah.
Okay. How are your ideas about justice and the greater good challenged by a global pandemic? For example, if we have limited resources with a COVID vaccine, how do we decide who is first in line?
Well, that's a hard question. I just, the other day, I'm teaching my justice course now in a revised, updated version online. We're teaching only remotely this year. And I've included examples drawn from the pandemic, including this exact question. Now, I recently had invited in someone, an economist colleague, who is something of a libertarian himself. And I asked, he's a free market enthusiast. He wrote a very prominent economics introductory textbook that's widely used. And we had this debate. I said, now, the government agencies, the National Institute of Health and others, are developing priority. We're not going to have a vaccine that will be available to everyone at the outset. Suppose we had 1 million doses. Who should be first in line? Well, I would say, and this government advisory body has recommended, frontline healthcare workers and those who are most vulnerable, those who are at greater risk of dying should they contract COVID. And then there are various other categories. I would add to that list those who are volunteers, paid or otherwise, in the trials for safety and efficacy. I think there would be quite a grave injustice if, having risked their health to test the vaccine,
Sure.
they were not toward the top of the list when it came to making it available. But I asked my economics colleague, would you favor this order of priority, or do you think it should be the million doses should go to the highest bidder, market principle? And he defended the market principle. And on familiar market grounds, I disagreed. We had a debate. The students joined in the debate. And then I asked, all right, suppose the government priority list was established and the doses were made available to frontline workers and those who are most vulnerable, people of a certain advanced age with certain comorbidities and so on. Should those people at the front of the line be free to go on eBay and say, I will sell? Could they scalp their coronavirus like people scalp tickets to, the World Series or to a Hamilton, tickets to Hamilton? And true to his principles, he said they should be free to sell them on the open market. I think this is, going back to debates about justice, I think this is an example of a good that money should not buy. I mean, when it's scarce.
Sure.
But the issue here, the issue of justice, is the relevant principle the willingness and ability to pay, or is the relevant principle of distribution need, medical need, or in the case of the healthcare providers, need arising from being in a certain social role that contributes to the common good, caring for COVID patients and so on, first responders and so on. But this is a classic example to test competing theories of distributive justice.
Fascinating. Unfortunately, we're short of time. The last question, which maybe we'll end with, knowing that we're a relative group of action. For those who've been persuaded by your arguments, what are some immediate steps? What are two things that people can do in their daily lives to make a difference in sort of adding a little bit more civility to our world?
Well, I would say insofar as we're acting as citizens, to press political leaders, candidates, political parties to shift their focus to this question of the dignity of work as a way of beginning to heal our society. I don't think we will heal simply by hortatory invocations of the need for civility. I think we have to address the source of the grievances. So as citizens, we can press candidates and political parties and political leaders to take these grievances seriously. As parents, and this goes back to an earlier part of the conversation, David, that you introduced. As parents, we can try to inculcate in our children a more sensitive balance between striving, conscientious effort, and an appreciation of luck, good fortune, indebtedness, and the learning of humility that goes with it. So as parents, we can help shape the attitudes of our children in a healthy direction. And then finally, with regard to ourselves and our own attitudes and practices toward the lives we live, the success we may enjoy, to rein in our tendency, and I suppose we all partake of it to some degree, of meritocratic hubris, and to remind ourselves of the luck and good fortune that helped us on our way, the sense in which we are indebted to a wide range of sources of help that and reminding ourselves of that indebtedness can point us toward a greater attentiveness to those who need our help as well. Those would be some suggestions, David.
Really fascinating. And as I said, unbelievably timely. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. The Tyranny of Merit, What's Become of the Common Good. We have copies for everybody who's participated on this Zoom. And obviously, I would encourage everybody to read it. So thank you so much for us. And I hope all of you get to read the book.
Thank you, David. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for having me and for
Terrific.
leading this conversation.
Thank you so much.